Joining Jay on stage for our next panel, Autonomous Everything, How Connected Transportation Will Change Mobility, and Which Companies Will Own This Future. We have Mike Burgess. Mike is a vice president at Cox Automotive, where he leads strategic development for the future of mobility and automotive, retail transformation, excuse me. In 2014, Mike founded Cox Automotive's digital retailing venture named Make My Deal, which is a business designed to help car dealers move the consumer vehicle purchase experience online. Also on the panel, we have Mark Norman. He's a managing partner at Fraser McCombs Capital. Previously, he was president of Zipcar, where he led the company's expansion into over 25 major cities and more than 300 college campuses across North America and Europe. And also, joining us for day 2 again, please help me welcome up Heather Somerville from Reuters. I'll welcome them up.
Oh, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I think we're going to start off first by hearing about Jay's newest patent in autonomous vehicles. Is that right?
No.
Oh,
Somebody else has that.
Okay. We do have a lot to talk about, though, so I'll just dive right in. So we hear a lot of brand predictions as to when autonomous vehicles will be on the road in a robust way, with Ford saying 2021 and others having even more aggressive predictions, all of which I'm highly skeptical of. So instead of talking about timeline, let's talk about how. How do you see consumers will first adopt or access autonomous vehicles? Will it be through a rideshare service? Will it be by going out and buying a car from a Detroit automaker? Why don't you kick us off, Mike, on that?
Sure. What we see happening in the market is that consumers are going to have another subscription. The same way that we got a phone bill, a cable bill, an ISP, and a wireless carrier, there's a new bill in the home called a mobility services provider. And it's not yet clear whether or not that's going to be an automaker that becomes an MSP like a Ford or an Uber that gets the technology to become that and then has to partner to get the fleet. But the mobility service provider is the answer. It's not a question of are the automakers the tech or the ride-sharing companies going to win. It's going to be the MSP, and the question is which companies from those known markets are going to become an MSP.
Okay.
You asking when, too?
If you want to be so bold, go ahead.
Sure, what the hell?
You better back it up, though.
No, I'm all excited about the bundling of the pricing, so I know what's going to be offered. I want money back on my
It's actually already happening
home,
with Lyft and Uber. I mean, they price flexibility. What kind of car, ride sharing, they're pricing the whole flexibility.
Yeah. No, I think the early days that we're going to see are these closed circuit, closed loop applications, right? Whether it's local motors doing a tour tram that's autonomously driven, whether it's, New Autonomy's got, micro fleet service in Singapore for a taxi bot service. And so some of those will be available, but the vast majority of us in the room are going to spend the next 15 years experiencing autonomy in very small micro applications like summons on steroids, where it might valet park your car from the front of your office building into the garage, or maybe in a super cruise application on the highway where it's only allowed for vehicles that have vehicle-to-vehicle connectivity and a certain level of level 4 autonomy to allow that. So
I think it's a CapEx question, really. I mean, ultimately, autonomous driving vehicles, especially in the US, are going to have a higher CapEx baseline because there's just going to be so much safety, so much redundancy in the early technologies. You're going to have a much more expensive vehicle. So it's going to undoubtedly either come in through a commercial application like a truck or a closed loop or a specific case, or it's going to come in through a service that pays for the CapEx for a $200,000 vehicle, but as long as you're using it 15 hours a day and you're constantly keeping it busy, in certain applications you can monetize the CapEx. But the bottom up, which would be like the consumer camera business, where the prosumer cameras basically took over from the top-down broadcast cameras, I don't think that's going to happen on a life-threatening technology, which is an on-the-road technology.
But to your point on the CapEx question, I think in an urban taxi bot application, I mean, it's fair to say that in this sort of application, right, Hertz rental car, Uber, even Zipcar converge, right? I mean, they're all sort of providing fleet to get somewhere, and they can, at least. If you took the insurance expense and the parking expense, because you can now park not at the city center but on the outskirts, and that becomes a service depot for cleaning and wireless inductive recharging and things like that. If you took those expenses out, Zipcar could pay twice as much money for the cars that were in the fleet and make a margin. So it sort of starts to dimension what we're talking about and when those things get to be affordable. And then you're talking about those levels of adoption, but maybe not a majority of the fleet in big cities anytime soon.
And so when we're talking about things like taxi bots, we're talking about urban areas, and kind of alluding to something that you've talked about, Mike, this idea that we're not going to be seeing autonomous cars roaming around the country roads in Iowa necessarily. They're going to be moving, you've described it as a school of fish. So I'm wondering how we achieve that, these sort of schools of autonomous cars in urban areas, given the challenges of operating in urban areas, which really no company has completely figured out.
Yeah, so the analogy I was drawing is that it's really based on the word autonomous. And I think we've actually got the wrong definition. Autonomous means independent and separate from others. And if you think about the safety required in an application like this, I think a much more appropriate name would be a networked automated vehicle. Because if you think about a school of fish, these things are not completely independent. They're not dependent on each other. There's no air traffic control for a school of fish, but they don't bump into each other. And this is what we have to achieve from a autonomy perspective, but also from a connected car perspective. You know, we're on a journey from cruise control incrementally up to autopilot for Honda Civics and Toyota Camrys and every other car. And those cars have to exist on the road with people that have no automation in their car and the cars that have no steering wheels. And to get those to not bump into each other, I just don't know how you do that when I can buy a GPS jammer on the internet for $400. If you don't have extreme levels of redundancy in the way that a set of interdependent fish don't bump into each other.
Well, so you need precise mapping, but precise identification, so you can say, hey, I know there's another car out there, but is it this one, and so on. And so there's a lot from a connectivity standpoint, but there's a whole host of other supporting things required to make that school of fish financially funded, well-serviced, and things like that are also impediments to getting these types of services off the ground in cities and near suburban areas.
Yeah, it's a system changeover, and the problem with system changeover is if it's not 100% changeover, all of your legacy issues suddenly muck up your current systems. It's why I think we're going to see it in farming way earlier. Autonomous vehicles make total sense in farming. Complete sense, right? You've got nobody to bump into, you've got no life-threatening issues, you've got a lot of acreage to cover, it's got to be plowed, it's got to be tilled, it's got to be fertilized, you know, it's not going to all be done from the air, I'm afraid.
No snow.
You know, right.
Not when you're farming.
Well, whatever. So the issue here, I think, is we're going to see it emerge from high-value applications that are at the fringe case, though a big case in the case of farming, and then those will steadily move into the higher urbanized hybrid environments where there are people on the road, where you're not going to be bumping into anything on a farm, and there is a lot of farm space.
And similar applications we've seen on college campuses or even corporate campuses with a lot of experimenting on autonomous golf carts, for instance.
Yeah, where there's nothing else to hit
Exactly.
other than, no other vehicles to deal with.
Yeah, but that other point of actually getting to the urban space, and Mark, maybe you could hit on this, is, I mean, the constant conversation has been how difficult the urban environment is. We had, you know, long interstate kind of taken care of a couple of decades ago when Carnegie Mellon sent a minivan across the country. What are the hurdles remaining in urban areas for autonomous vehicles, and how far away are we from clearing them?
CES showed a lot of progress. I think, Delphi was running around town, in downtown Las Vegas with an autonomous vehicle. I saw Dan Ammon this week at GM show, his live from the rear seat video of, 20 minutes in San Francisco in a GM autonomous vehicle. It was funny because it was sped up, and you could see the vehicle pause, for example, when another car was sort of partly double parked. Think of it as kind of a foot and a half out in the lane, and it stopped like it was a red light.
Here? Yeah.
And it made its way around and so on. But the point isn't as much well marked, downtown environments. Talking to Chris Urmson at Google, it's that first and last mile. It's getting in and out of the driveway because, again, the residential streets are less marked. There's more variables with kids and whatnot, and so that becomes the hard part. And that's why I kind of make the point on low-speed closed-circuit applications like urban parking can do that because it's a repetitive route, or you talk about a university campus or something like that, a dedicated route or a farm. Those will make it possible. So it's not so much cities, because you can see that today, but it's getting back to optimizing the network and the cost, and getting folks to let go of their cars. And what percent of my trip requirements can it solve? How soon? And if it's 2 or 3 out of 200 or 300, thanks, but I'll take a ride. I'm not trading my car.
And we have ethical issues too. I mean, especially in the United States, where we have a fairly litigious society. We're going to have to make life and death decisions where can the software be allowed to kill somebody? Because there's no question a driver has to choose between swerving into oncoming traffic and avoiding the child who's running out into the street after the ball. Somebody is going to die in that scenario. Psychologists call it, will you kill the fat man? If you can basically switch the switch to kill one person instead of 3. These are real choices. People who are behind the wheel of a vehicle make life and death decisions, not in every day, and that will happen by the software. So we are facing an ethical environment to say, are we going to approve software that will kill the child as opposed to swerve and hit the minivan? There's no kidding around, and the first time we avoid those decisions and it happens, you're going to have a total shutdown of all this software, just as if an airplane were being flown by by a not pilot, by a piece of software, and to save the people in the airplane, it had to veer into a school. We certainly would not put up with that. So these are not issues people like to talk about, but there's no question we're dealing with life and death decisions, and really the death side of the software.
Yeah, I think that's why we really need to focus a great deal on what NHTSA refers to as level 3 and level 4 autonomy, or automation, which is all about autopilot, as Tesla calls it. And I don't see the removal of the steering wheel as the next incremental change past autopilot. It's a step function. Because what happens, and as Jay said, is as soon as the steering wheel is gone, now the liability and insurability equation completely changes. And I would be very surprised if we ever had a situation where a consumer were allowed to own a level 5 vehicle, because when it's on its way to school to pick up Susie and gets in a wreck, whose fault is it? Is it yours because you didn't patch it with Service Pack 2, or is it the dog that ran across the street? Who knows, right? But the steering wheel, which is level 5 full autonomy, I just believe is a step function, not an incremental change, and everything up to that point is just fancy cruise control.
But we've seen, Volvo and others say, hey, when we get to 4 and 5, we know the onus is on us. And so I think that will become a litigation
Except the
liability.
law will have to protect them, because essentially the human makes the decision now on to take which life in the equation in real time based on innumerable variables. It looked like a person, but it was actually a kid dressed in a Halloween, looked like a dog, but it was a kid dressed in a Halloween costume that looked like a dog. Okay, you're talking about levels of subtle failure here that we're not anywhere near ready to take on in the U.S. With a legal infrastructure to support Volvo.
Right, and also, of course, this brings up insurance companies, and I know several of the major insurance companies don't even have a clear-cut way to address aftermarket products that would add some sort of automation, some type of cruise control capabilities to a car. So, I mean, Volvo may step up and say it's on us, but have insurance companies that you've heard of made any sort of clear-cut statements? And if so, how do they catch up?
I think we're going to see more and more adoption and even potential mandates of some of the level 2 and 3 technology, because it makes such a big difference in safety. Again, the collision mitigation systems, lane tracking systems, things like that make current cars so much safer. And you sort of say, what percent is that going to reduce the accidents? Haven't you checked?
Yeah.
They're up by single-digit percentages, 7 to 9% in the last 2 years. Why? We can all suppose a bunch of theories about distracted driving and whatnot. But there is better technology to help the insurers today mitigate the 35,000 lives lost on highways each year in the States. That's a good start.
What we're starting to see is, in terms of insurance, is the car changing from a product into a service. And at Cox Automotive, we have a small company called FlexDrive that's a few years into operation. And it's a car you can sign up for as a subscription on an app on your phone. You pay a weekly a fee, and it includes all the maintenance and the insurance. Well, you can't imagine the amount of effort that went into getting that insurance policy in place, which didn't exist before. Now, you may have a lot to share in terms of insurance related to automotive, but it's a new breed, right? The car as a subscription. Now, this is not an autonomous vehicle, but those models, you think purchase, lease, and subscribe as the next version of engaging in not owning a car, but having one dedicated to you. That paves the way for how you can think about subscribing to a mobility service that might be autonomous in the future.
But Jack, back to Jay's bundles. I mean, we're talking about usage-based everything. I mean, right, usage-based insurance is the tip of the iceberg. It's
Absolutely.
usage-based underwriting, usage-based maintenance contract, usage-based car wash subscription, things like that.
And if you're willing to be flexible and wait longer for your pickup, you're going to spend less for it. If you're willing to ride share, you'll spend even less for it. I mean, flexibility is going to ripple through that whole system, no question about it. You know, we have autonomous vehicles that are fully connected, and we all use them all the time. They're called commercial airplanes. Pilots do not fly the planes. This is the big secret. All right, the pilots have nothing to do with flying the airplane you took to get here. Nothing. In fact, not only do the computers land and take off the airplane, but if a pilot were to try and actually fly the plane, what happens is the tower will call that pilot, air traffic control, and will ask him, why are you hand flying the airplane? Literally, they have a term for it. It's called hand flying. None of your commercial jets are hand-flown anymore. The computers fly it 100% of the time. And it's just as true for the Navy and the naval jets, and the computers can fly the plane 100%. I mean, the pilots are there as backup for when the triple redundant software fails. So the only thing is, nobody's getting on an airplane without a pilot up front, okay? Right. And the reason is because we just don't damn trust the software to do the job. We all want to see a pilot and a co-pilot in the front of that plane.
But
so,
is the software making pilots better? No.
No, in fact, the pilots are worse, okay, because the pilots are basically sitting there and monitoring the software. So we have autonomous vehicles that are truly serving the public. It's just that avoiding other airplanes is a whole lot easier than avoiding, on the city streets with all the drivers we have.
So, and I think this might get back to your theme of flexibility, Jay, but how does, car connectivity, automation, autonomy change the nature of how we think of fleets? Talking about your car without the steering wheel, are those ever going to be owned by individual people, or will they be some sort of collective fleet and rotate between driveways? Or are these cars even going to be public utilities?
Well, I got to tell you what I think. So here's how I look at it. We're building a generation of young people who don't want to own cars. It's remarkable. But you go and see young kids today, and they don't even want their driver's license, let alone own a vehicle. It used to be your car was your identity when you were growing up. It was your freedom. It was your license to be independent from your parents. It was so many things. It was your customized world. It was your thing. Their mobile phone is their thing today. It's their apps is their thing. Their computer's their thing. Their phone, the car is not their thing. So that's a world in which I'm way more willing to outsource it on a utility basis, because that's what Uber is to these young kids. It's just simply a mobility utility.
Yeah, the data shows that it's actually the cost of ownership is the biggest deterrent. Not that they don't want to own, just that they can't afford it. Millennials are people too. They just have more student debt.
I was going to say, saying that they don't want to own cars is like saying, hey, we've done the research, they want to live in their parents' basement.
I don't know. I got to tell you, these kids in cars, they have changed. It's not your father's Oldsmobile in their head. Okay?
I'm a Generation Xer, and everything that I've ever heard about millennials, they said about us. And we turned out to be not so lazy after all.
That's funny.
But you want to go to Mars.
Yeah, right.
So, kind of an investor question here. There is, full stack, autonomous startups, And there's increasingly startups that are working on specific technology that may not be exclusively for autonomous cars, but certainly have autonomous car applications. You know, solid state LiDAR, I know is getting a lot of attention, a lot of funding. From an investor standpoint, what are you and your fellow VCs looking for in startups that come knocking?
Yeah, I thought Mark made good points earlier on. There's definitely a vein of R&D related things, definitely much more from the incubators and the accelerators on certain technologies. And again, whether it's long-range radar, whether it's flash or solid-state LiDAR, whether it's new battery technologies. You talk about even a modest level of electrification by 2025 will require 30 gigafactories at a cost of $3 billion apiece. And that's 10% market penetration of EVs. But to make those same batteries go the range, the recharge time, and cost that we need at $100 a kilowatt hour, we need new technology for that. So there's definitely connections and relationships with different universities and so on the research side of things. But to some of the things that Mike was getting at, we see huge opportunity in the service layer, whether that's financing, new different financing models, whether it's the customer experience. You look at how much VC money has gone into selling used cars online, right? And some of those parts of the experience, shopping for service, is a friction point that was not unlike getting a taxi 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, the hailing and payment part of getting a taxi was awful, right? It was very humbling. You know, do you have a credit card? You know, and you don't deal with that anymore. And there are some of those same pain points in service connections on what does my car need? Don't sell me more than I need. What's a fair price to pay? And can you pick it up and drop it off? Back to your bundling point. Those are huge opportunities and big disruptors on the customer experience.
Yeah, and you were talking about, I think, almost like a fintech vertical within the car space.
You look at the cash that flows through this business, and again, particularly in a buoyant industry when we, last year did over 17 million units and at $33,000 a piece. There's a lot of cash and debt, and that's not even counting the service side of things. Different ways to make it affordable, spreading things out into payments, bundling services, and underwriting those. So whether it's service repair financing, whether it's usage-based underwriting, a whole host of things, just because of the sheer ticket size going through it is pretty important too.
Yeah, 17 million new, and then altogether something on the order of 45 million, including used. So in terms of the questions of investment and where do we see things happening, I'll answer the question a little bit different way, which is, the way I think about connected car and autonomous is that they're not the same thing, but they're certainly, in at least some ways, codependent. And what I don't see happening yet is a cooperation between the roads, the networks, and the cars. And you see automakers thinking that the autonomous vehicle is an independent robot that's going to exist without a network to some degree, and the telematics and wireless network companies aggressively going after owning the data and the flow of data, and especially around mapping, telematics, et cetera. And there's an ongoing debate about DSRC versus 5G for how V2V is going to work and V2I, and don't leave out V2P, pedestrian, one of the most important ones. And so we have, and then the cities and the smart cities and the DOT. So if we can get the FCC, DOT, and NHTSA to agree on a set of standards for how we're going to have a car with no smartphone, a car with a smartphone with a Waze on steroids kind of app that tells them how to not bump into others and where to go to be there quicker, and then we have the autopilot, and then ultimately the car without the steering wheel. How is that going to coexist? And who is ultimately the ICANN of the Internet of driving? And how is that going to work? And if we see companies investing in that space, that would be one I would pay a lot of attention to around, all of the ecosystem that's going to make this future of mobility happen. And then there's a whole, as you said, a whole set of technologies, hardware, software, et cetera, just around how do you get to the car without a steering wheel, and that's a layer on top.
Yeah, it looks a little bit in some ways like medical and healthcare, where the opportunity is so big that any slice of it is big enough to support an entire ecosystem. So you've got an enormous amount of waste in mobility, a lot of asset underutilization, a lot of death and derivative, and injury, derivative elements of the system. So there are so many points of attack. It's no surprise that the VC community is just picking them off, even without an overarching set of, hey, if we just could get some, standards going here, just think how much we could really unlock with a true playing field that knew how to talk to each other.
Right. And we think a lot about the base hits along the way. So we can envision a perfect again, the network and infrastructure that supports the level 5 vehicle. But GM's got 12 million connected cars on the road today. How many people renew the OnStar subscription? Single-digit percent, low single-digit percent, probably less, right? And so to be able to say, instead of making, again, insurance carry most of the freight for connectivity today, which is paying for these OBD2 plug-in devices, to say, what are the other ways to monetize it through some premium models to limit the cost with not having superfluous hardware and connectivity charges, but then other transactional ways that it isn't as much as, again, my haptic seat knows what mood I'm in and my Hyperloop pod going to work in 50 years and knows that exactly what I like to drink and what I like when I got a sore throat, as much as to say today, what is it to relay the connected dealership, for example, to say, hey, it knows exactly what my car needs and I can build trust and rapport through fair pricing. And a service level that I'm probably not getting today. Like I said, pick up and drop off, for example. And to me, it redefines brands today. I saw something this week about the windshield being the new display platform. And you kind of go, couldn't you envision a car brand that's the no advertising platform? Would people pay a little more to be in the premium, connectivity segment? But, little things like that start to turn some of the fountains in showrooms definition of brand experience on its ear a little bit.
If I could add,
Please.
The connected car today, we see usage-based insurance, a little bit of usage-based taxes in some states, and then we have the teen tracker, the service reminder. But the trouble I see in connected car, and the reason this is relevant to autonomous, is you've got to have a connected network of driving, I believe, before you get to autonomous. Is that the problem with connected car, at least from what I see, is there's no killer app. And until email came, my friends didn't know why they needed a PC, and until cat videos, the internet didn't have a purpose. And so if we can focus on what is the killer app of connected driving, and I believe it's getting there faster and safer, and all of these other UBI, teen tracker, service reminder, those can piggyback on the same pipe that's going to get us there faster, but we've got to get energized around the killer app, because until then, we're late for soccer practice, and I'm not re-signing up for my OnStar or whatever it is, right? The family's doing other stuff, and we've got to reach out and figure out why they're going to pay another $60, $80, $100 a month for yet another thing on top of the internet, wireless, cable, whatever that they're already paying for.
So I want to talk about regulation a little bit before we turn to questions from the audience. So we have a seriously patchwork approach to regulating autonomous vehicles. Detroit, Arizona have welcomed them almost unconditionally. Arizona put up a banner for Uber when it arrived in town, and California's taken a different approach. Chicago's taken a much more, almost saying no in many regards to them. So how do startups scale, and how do they get enough miles under their belt to prove the consistency of a technology when there is this patchwork approach at the state level? And what should both state regulators be doing as well as NHTSA?
First thing, I just make a comment on jurisdiction in that NHTSA governs the vehicle, right? So nationwide types of requirements, and then states govern usually driver approval and local roadways, right? And so Nevada, for example, being early to approve long-haul trucking, for example, is a way to understand at least some of these closed circuits we were talking about earlier that might be good test beds. And so there's where the battle wages between Michigan and California for application testing. Ontario's trying to do some things. The weather's horrible, so it's a good place to test some of those things. But being able to differentiate, so when some companies get asked by NHTSA, show your work, and they balk and say, hey, we're shutting down, NHTSA's trying to say, hey, we're trying to scale best practices, not trying to disseminate trade secrets. But in the interest of safety, that's pretty important.
Yeah.
And so NHTSA's been strong on policy and trying to be patient on regulation, and I think it's a pretty good approach.
Well, maybe I'll throw in a shameless plug for Atlanta. So we think about the assets there. Mercedes-Benz USA is headquartered there, Porsche Cars North America. We have Cox Automotive, of course, and then Verizon Telematics, AT&T Drive Studios there. Georgia Tech has one of the biggest robotics labs in the country. And so I think if we can form some centers in the States, at least around hubs for mobility innovation and R&D, and create some test facilities, which are happening, I believe, in Detroit and other areas, that create the ecosystem. I mean, those are the places and environments in which startups and other big corporate investments can thrive and be tested and come to life. And if we can get the energy right in the right places, and I think it also requires, as you mentioned, Mark, we've got to get NHTSA and a couple of more pieces of the puzzle, DOT, FCC, and their respective constituents, all focused on solving these problems.
Right. Okay. And final word, Jay?
Well, I just think it's a leadership issue. I mean, you're actually talking about political leadership. At the end of the day, that's tough to do, especially in our country. So, if you have political leadership, then you basically create a consensus of people saying, let's come together and do this damn thing. Without political leadership, essentially what will happen is you'll export it to foreign jurisdictions. It'll get tested in Europe, or get tested in Asia or Singapore or other places, and that's where the innovations will essentially get road tested, no bad pun intended, and it'll migrate here. Those are your two choices. It's never been any different.
Right. Thanks. I've got about 4 minutes left, so time for a couple questions.
Sure. The last comment is sort of a good segue into the first question, which is, we've been talking a lot about the autonomous car landscape in the U.S. How does it look different in foreign countries, and is that something that you think about in your respective businesses?
I would just say to Jay's point, I mean, you look at China with the speed of development of certain cities and the sort of greenfield approach to infrastructure, so not having to deal with legacy or hybrid rework. Yeah, Baidu and any number of a dozen of Chinese cities could jump on this stuff pretty quick.
And a command economy, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately in these kind of changeovers like gauges on rails, okay, governments are ideally suited for top-down command structures, which says this is how it will be. We live in a vibrant, democratic, contentious world, and we don't do well with those kinds of commands.
Litigation doesn't help.
We don't do well.
Which companies are best positioned to take market share in the autonomous car market? If any of you have a specific answer to this.
I would say the tier one suppliers are investing a lot, making a lot of acquisitions, and when it becomes an optimization question, so again, we talked earlier that most of the technologies are here, but making them, there's a big policy battle to make them widespread adoption, but then also an optimization challenge to say, what is the right number and cost trade-off of cameras and sonar and LiDAR and which LiDAR and things like that. And so the short answer, I think, is going to be, some of the major tier ones are working on that optimization equation today. The Delphis, the Bosches, the Continentals, LG in Korea, to get some great systems out, but they're also pretty voracious looking at new R&D technologies. So, Magna just put money into an Israeli LiDAR company, Innovize. It's less than a year old. So, short answer is tier one, but lots of R&D angles to help make them successful in a pretty complicated ecosystem.
Yeah, without naming any brands in particular, I think a great analog is wireless. So we have hardware, OS, and network. And you might look for winners in each of those three categories, and autonomous as well. And there's some likely players in each.
And look for Google and Uber and the tech companies certainly to partner and play like a tier one and selling it agnostically to multiple manufacturers.
Great. This question is directed towards Jay. Some of the new travel companies are focusing on speed of travel, so from supersonic jets to Hyperloop. What would you think the effect would be on the travel industry if you start seeing new tiers of speed in the
I think it'd be relatively small. The reason is that the speed of the actual vehicle is almost an irrelevant component in the door-to-door experience. Just getting to the airport or the point of departure is itself 2 hours, and if you're going to LaGuardia, it's forever. The system is so infrastructure constrained and so failure prone that even if you were to improve the mid segment of the total trip, your end-to-end segment time is going to absorb almost all of your efficiency. You can be on a jet that's twice the speed. Guess what? Door to door, it's not too much different. When you wait, like I did last night, 45 minutes for a gate at LAX, I don't care how fast you landed on the runway. So we're not about to have a revolution in door to door speed. We're much more likely to have a revolution in not caring about it. So that you'll be internet connected, you'll be enjoying yourself, watching your Netflix, and being much less irritated by the fact that the physical infrastructure is so badly constrained and so desperately in need of re-engineering that you wish you could fix some part of it in some meaningful way. But I'm afraid to say in the United States we have structural, in every sense of the word, disadvantages.
And the last question is across the panel. Elon Musk has previously said that the end goal of driverless cars could be that driving itself is illegal. Is that a possibility you see in the future?
Not in America, at least not when we have the kind of country that we think we have. We're pretty fiercely independent, and if you're going to pry my gun out of my dead fingers, and we can still have as much violent crime among mentally ill people as we do who use guns, obviously we're not going to be prying any steering wheels out of anybody's hands anytime soon. That being said, I could certainly imagine it in China.
Yeah, certain city centers, who'd have thought we'd have congestion pricing in London? We've had it for years, and so you can see some of that. But I've got a son who's 18, and you don't want to drive next to him on Boston area highways. So being late on some of this stuff's good.
I think, someday perhaps driving is a luxury like owning a horse is today. And maybe there's a tax that goes with that, what have you. But I'm with you, Jay. This is a free country after all.
We hope.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Mike, Jay, and Mark, very much for your comments.